Welcome back to The Sower, a production of the Ciceronian Society. We are an interdisciplinary group of Christian scholars dedicated to the study of tradition, place, and things divine. To learn more about us and our programs, please visit ciceroniansociety.org. If you enjoy The Sower, please check out our new video podcast, Cicero on Duties, published every Wednesday on YouTube. I'm Chris Anadale, podcast editor for the Society. I also run a philosophy YouTube channel and teach philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. Today's special episode is a recording of a panel from our 2025 annual conference in Harrisonburg, Virginia. This is the sixth and final 2025 conference panel we'll share on The Sower. You can find the others in episodes 47, 52, 56, 58, and 69. Today's panel is titled Philip Rieff, Cultural Conflict, Religion, and the Self. After a prayer and brief introduction, we hear the following speakers. First, Michael Harding of Montgomery College with Rieff's use of Nietzsche in Deathworks. Second, William Batchelder of Waynesburg University on the impossibility of charisma in the modern context. Third, Alexander-Davey of Campbell University with the role of elites in formation and deformation. Fourth, Albert Norton, independent scholar, on identity in the Therapeutic Age. Following the fourth speaker is a 13-minute question and answer period. Mr. Norton was interviewed in episode 40 of The Sower, and Drs. Harding and Batchelder most recently appeared in episode 69, an introduction to the work of Philip Rieff. Dr. Alexander-Davey is an occasional host of The Sower. If you like what you hear, consider attending our next conference, March 12th to 14th, 2026, in Omaha, Nebraska. Here's the panel.
Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope lunch was great and all that kind of thing. We got to start this panel. So I'm going to go ahead with the introductions after I need my notes. Glasses. My eyes have grown weary in the service of assessment. I'll start with prayers we always try to do here at the Ciceronian Society. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Okay. So I want to begin this panel, which celebrates in part the release of the philosophy of Philip Rieff, Cultural Conflict, Religion, and the Self, by thanking the Ciceronian Society, which is a society of scholars and of friends, and which largely provided the crew that we put together to make this book happen. So Michael Harding, my co-editor, is also on the board of the Ciceronian Society, where I am chair. And many of our contributors are here this weekend. Ethan, who's also on the board of Ciceronian. Chris Anadale, whose giant white microphone is here, even though at the moment he is not. Executive Director Josh Bowman contributed an article as well. President James Patterson contributed an article. And Jacob Wolf. I also want to thank some friends who are not here. Elizabeth Lash Quinn, Carl Truman, Yiftach Ofek, and Pietas editor Kevin Slack, who contributed chapters to this volume as well. We also thank Bloomsbury Academic. Now, to introduce the panel, I think I'll introduce everybody at once, and then I'll just go through. Presenting first will be Michael Harding, Chair of Philosophy at Montgomery College, co-editor of the volume, and contributed the chapter, You Should Be Closest in Heart to Him When You Resist Him, Rieff's use of Nietzsche in Deathworks. After that will be me. Where am I? I'm William Batchelder, Professor of History at Waynesburg University, co-edited and did two chapters, one on Rieff and authority called The Peculiar God of Philip Rieff, and one with the lovely and talented James Patterson, Beloved Community and Black Power, an application of Rieff's theory to the divergence of King and Carmichael in the civil rights movement, where we consider what I'll be considering today, which is Rieff and charisma. Next will be Ethan. Ethan Alexander-Davey is an assistant professor of political science at Campbell, and he contributed the chapter Freud, Culture, and the Function of Political Elites, Philip Rieff on the Virtuosi of Creation and Decreation. Ethan, we also celebrate with Ethan another volume, which came out the same month of ours, and to which Michael also contributed, so we recognize that as well, called Aristocratic Voices, Forgotten Arguments about Virtue, Authority, and Inequality. We are delighted to be joined also today by a new friend, also versed in Rieff's work. Albert Norton is a practicing attorney and author of several books on the tension between religion and postmodernism. His next book, The Discovered Self, is to be released in April and concerns what he regards a dangerous inward turn, which is key to the therapeutic worldview. And so he'll be concluding the panel by invoking Rieff's concept of the therapeutic, which is one of his most important. So we will begin with Michael Harding.
So I'm going to dive right into this. We might ask, why Nietzsche? In Deathworks, Nietzsche is not the first author Rieff invokes. That honor goes to James Joyce, but the second. Nevertheless, the invocation of Nietzsche early in Deathworks says much to us about the roots of Rieff's own understanding of culture. Rieff notes that, quote, culture is the form of fighting before the firing begins, and that the subordinate sociological form of culture is complicit in its fighting form. World creation / rule. Rieff then cites Nietzsche's Gay Science, Book 5, Section 358, titled The Peasant Rebellion of the Spirit. There, Nietzsche begins by describing the contemporary scene. Quote, a few things are still towering, much looks decayed and uncanny. Where has one ever seen more beautiful ruins? Nietzsche then turns to an account of Luther as a destructive force. Nietzsche's Luther is a death worker against the church, ultimately animated by, quote, an abysmal hatred of the higher human being and the dominion of the higher human beings as conceived by the church. He smashed an ideal that he could not attain, while he seemed to fight and abhor the degeneration of this ideal. Luther, quote, pushed away the dominion of the homines religiosi. Rieff's footnote quotes Nietzsche's observation that, quote, a church is above all a structure for ruling, but omits the rest of Nietzsche's comment. A church, or given the context of Nietzsche's discussion, perhaps the church, is above all a structure for ruling that secures the highest rank to the more spiritual human beings, that believes in the power of spirituality to the extent of forbidding itself the use of all cruder instruments of force, and on that score alone, the church is under all circumstances a nobler institution than the state. Nietzsche's point is, in a way, Rieff's point as well. The institutions of second world culture are more effective means of world creation and, more importantly, world recreation or world sustaining than institutions like the state. Institutions such as the church have the effect of creating and recreating or ordering and reordering the world. True culture expresses and celebrates this power of recreation. Culture, writes Rieff, is a continuation of war by other normative means. They both have the same ultimate concern. What Rieff calls third culture is the world after Nietzsche's death of God. First and second cultures are both characterized by external authorities, quoting Rieff, various as Platonic Athens and Aboriginal Australia in first culture, faith grounded in the historical event of revelation in the second culture. In second culture, one finds, quote, largely prohibitive commandments, interdictory in character, which must be kept and originate in that authorial God, one or three in one. Third culture, however, is characterized precisely by their lack, i.e. the lack of God and the lack of any norms grounded in external authority or any sort of sacred order, be it pagan or of the book, each of which serve to place limits on what Rieff calls the primacy of possibilities. According to Rieff, third culture is not a doctrine or voluntary discipline of obedience to the truths of absolute authority, but tidbits of opportunity that depend upon energy available to exploit those opportunities. This is a quote from Rieff, by the way. The most exemplary opportunities are shared with all animal life, therefore, by the animal rights movement, the interest in food and sex. Lastly, third culture is characterized by a relation to the past that does not treat it as a source of meaning. Quote, third world denial and negation of the past is primordial, writes Rieff, and the radical contemporaneity that it promotes will not be shut out of lives devoted to resisting it, let alone lives devoted to nothing much at all. The parallel to the last man of Nietzsche's Zarathustra is perhaps obvious. So what will become of humanity in a third cultural world, and how do we get there? How did we get here? Rieff suggests in part that the tropes of the first world have been recycled by third culture warriors to attack the aesthetics of authority upon which the second cultural world has always been grounded. In this recycling and use, however, there is also a domestication or exsanguination of them. The terrors of the first world are rendered safe and harmless. The furies are neither truly terrifying nor truly avenging, and taboo is a plaything for the artist, rather than a sign that one risks the dangerous transgression of an interdict. Rieff characterizes this third world as no culture at all, but an anti-culture invented by, quote, radically remissive late second world elites. So Rieff breaks social history into three broad epochs. First worlds, by which he means both paganism and pre-Christian classical philosophy. Second worlds, by which he means biblical revelation. And third worlds, which I've suggested are coeval with Nietzsche's Death of God. He characterizes culture in general as, quote, our ingeniously developed limitations constituted by two motifs which are dialectically related, interdicts and remissions from interdicts. Every culture is so constituted, he says, that there are actions one cannot perform, more precisely, would dread to perform. There are remissions specific to the interdicts. These interdictory remissive complexes are more or less compelling. Human action is organized in these terms. To the degree that they are imperative, interdictory remissive complexes are observable, especially by those who do not feel compelled by them. For the imperative thrust of an interdictory remissive symbolic is into character. So interdicts, he says, are, quote, the knots of sacred order and the commanding truths in the vertical aesthetic of authority. They are, quote, eternally commanded prohibitions constituting a system of constraint. Interdicts must be not only clear and well-defined, but unalterable. Elsewhere, he notes that they are, quote, the primary form of high culture, not the arts and sciences. Neither literary studies nor scientific constitute cultures. These interdicts have a formative power, as both Rieff and Nietzsche recognize. You might recall Nietzsche's comment about the impact of these interdicts on humanity in Beyond Good and Evil. There, he says, they have improved mankind through, quote, a long unfreedom of the spirit, the mistrustful constraint in the communicability of thought, the discipline that thinkers imposed on themselves, thinking within certain guidelines imposed by the church or court or Aristotelian presuppositions, the long spiritual will to interpret every event according to a Christian scheme. By a symbolic, Rieff means, quote, a pattern of moral demands, a range of standard self-expectations about what we may and may not do in the face of infinite possibilities. The great symbolics of the West that he uses as examples are the Jewish and Greek symbolics, which he says, quote, have been constituted by repressive, militant ideals opposing the destructive splendor of human possibilities. This destructive splendor is grounded in our character as human beings. But while everything is possible to human beings as such, he says, quote, we are members of a culture in the sense that everything is not permitted to us, nor even conceivable by us. The functional symbolic is driven into character by what Rieff calls God terms, values that forbid certain actions and thereby encourage others. They express those significant inhibitions that characterize us all within a culture. They are, he says, compelling truths. In second world culture, there are interdicts, divine commands, and means of remission, i.e. forgiveness, atonement for violation of the interdicts or sin. First and second world cultures are grounded in an orientation towards something outside of themselves, a sacred order that informs and shapes the social order. Third culture, however, isn't grounded in reference to anything outside of itself. Rieff says such cultures are self-consuming. There is nothing outside of itself as far as it is concerned, and it should be considered, he says, an anti-culture. Anti-cultures, he writes, translate no sacred order into social. Recycling fantasy firsts, third worlds exist only as negations of sacred orders in seconds. So Rieff's third culture is explicitly, then, the world after Nietzsche's Death of God, and the social order is not a reflection of sacred order. Third worlds, writes Rieff, propose an unprecedented present age without moralities and religions. Nietzsche's prediction of this in The Gay Science, Rieff suggests, is put into the mouth of a madman because Nietzsche employed, quote, a piety of rationalism against the horrors that must come after the rationalization of God out of existence. Rieff notes that this also undermines both science and art, which, quote, liberated from all theological reference, could constitute themselves as composed notes toward a supreme fiction that was understood to be supreme only as fiction. His point, like Nietzsche's, is that this is not a moral and political crisis only, but also a scientific and creative crisis. One should not forget that Nietzsche's atheism is a tragic atheism, because Nietzsche knows what is lost when God and metaphysics have, quote, died. Third culture is a social order lacking a sacred order, of which it is a lower reflection. Third cultures, says Rieff, read nothing but themselves. In their lives among the ruins of second, third world elites represent actings out of an unprecedented autonomy, life without any predicative sacred order. Third culture, then, is the culture of last men, the metaphysical and post-religious order of people like Richard Rorty. It is characterized, says Rieff, by lives undevoted to anything in particular except entertainment and eating up life. As Rieff notes, Nietzsche's horror at the advent of atheism is itself somehow atavistic. The abandonment of what Rieff calls the vertical in authority, he says, creates no longer such a dreadful feeling as Nietzsche expresses. His religious sensibility is by no means general in the population. But is this not simply to note that what Nietzsche feared, the decline of humanity into last men, has largely come to pass? It's in response to this tragic knowledge that we can most clearly perceive the break Rieff is making with Nietzsche. Rieff is a radically more pessimistic figure than Nietzsche, who thinks the philosopher can shepherd humanity through the crisis of nihilism. Rieff, however, sees nothing but, quote, an all-consuming, godless third world culture in the offing. He says it is unprecedented in human history. Now, could a recovery of the pre-modern conception of nature address contemporary problems? Perhaps. Could such a recovery be possible in our late modern or postmodern third cultural world? That's a different question. As Rieff pessimistically notes, the Kulturkampf between second world sacred orders and third world anti-sacred social orders is now worldwide. There is no escape from the struggle. This struggle, he says, is unique because it is not between sacred orders, but between great abolitionist movements directed against all sacred orders in any of their historical or theoretical manifestations. As a society, we're increasingly divided. We do not see ourselves united by a common set of God terms, history, or culture, and instead we tend to focus on our own subjective desires as being the greatest or even the only good. And this perhaps is the biggest obstacle that third culture presents. Many of us don't think of anything beyond our own desires, and many of us lack the moral imagination requisite to this kind of thinking. And it's not that such an imagination doesn't exist, but the development of it is stunted by third culture. The best case is that we have, like Rieff himself, quote, half a mind in third culture camp, torn between second and third culture, living in the ruins of sacred truth, or what Nietzsche might call the ruins of Platonism. The reigning moral view is that one should do what one wants, provided it doesn't harm anyone. Like the Athenians of old, we third cultural late moderns chafe under Socratic reproach. This too follows from Rieff's basic diagnosis of third culture, which is characterized by a lack of orientation toward anything outside of itself, such as fate or nature in first culture or the God of revelation in second culture. Fate, he says, is that God term of first culture which decrees its non-negotiable terms to the gods, who are not what is prepotent in them and in their conduct, the primordial meta-divine. It teaches, he says, no moralities, nor does it teach immoralities. Fate is merely remorseless. In second world culture, he says, there is no primordial realm of power above, beyond, or parallel to the authorial divine. Nothing is meta-divine. Everything beneath the authorial divine is its creation. The superb thing in creation is the human. Rieff's third culture is the world after the death of God. It is grounded in a sacrifice that Nietzsche had identified as part of the ladder of religious cruelty. Again, that's in Beyond Good and Evil, Part 3. Rieff writes, quote, that the third sacrifice in our sacred history already has been made can come as no revelation. Revelation in the second culture refers to the unalterable directive word of God. Precisely the negation of that word is implicit in the third sacrifice. It denies and humiliates the word, absolute in its authority and incarnate in a historical man very like God, except in his fears that he has been forsaken by God. A radically immanentist third culture has been invented out of the detritus of transcendent truths from which the second derived its right to life. Nietzsche's last man is unbothered by anything because he knows there are no eternal truths. The world of last men is radically immanentist, as is seen most clearly in what Zarathustra calls their regard for health. Rieff's therapeutic third cultural man is unbothered by anything because the therapeutic culture teaches acceptance of what one is, no matter what one is. It is, he says, the social procedure of release from the authority of the past. i.e. from all historical interdicts. Rieff might suggest that therapy becomes a way of reconciling oneself to one's own, in Second World terms, sinfulness. But rather than overcoming one's sins or achieving a remission for offenses against what Rieff calls the vertical authority, therapeutic man is merely reconciled to them. Because there is no sacred order that is reflected in the social order of third culture, there are no standards against which one can judge oneself and find oneself wanting. This, of course, is Nietzsche's great concern, too, that the loss of a standard takes away the justification for self-overcoming. Of course, Nietzsche thinks most, if not all, such standards are false, but nonetheless, they are necessary for human greatness. Now, Rieff is surely pessimistic, but he does provide the briefest of sketches of what a fourth culture might look like in Crisis of the Officer Class. Mostly, however, he merely suggests that many of us, himself included, are trapped between second and third culture. If there were a fourth culture, he writes, it would be characterized by a closing of the split in second culture, i.e. the unification of Judaism and Christianity on the level of common practice, quote, when every Christian becomes an observant Jew in his orthopraxis and every Jew a Christian in his. Then and only then will the split in second culture be closed. The sketch of fourth culture he offers in Crisis seems to require some sort of eruption of the divine into third culture. It is not clear that Rieff thinks there could be a human solution. Rather, we find that Rieff agrees with Nietzsche that no one is free to be a crab. Rieff writes, we cannot repeat the mythic truths of the first, nor the historic truths of the second, nor the psychological truths of the third. If we could repeat ourselves, then we would see that the repetitions are never the same, that tradition is a weaving of fictive thread. No individual talent, not a single negative capability, nor any minister or angel of grace can defend us against the nothing that is the object of perfection according to the vision of the third culture's poets and other artists, addressing nothing other than the nothing that is the perfection of the third cultural mind. The best we can do, if we would live freely in the fourth culture, is to live again the otherness of, and the greatest fact and equally the greatest fiction of the second. Once lived with, their merchants understood, and the price of that understanding paid, the Messiah will come, but only when one is no longer necessary. Then no one will be crucified, sacred order will be absolutely identical with social order. And this passage brings to my mind Heidegger in the famous Der Spiegel interview, where he claims that philosophy will not be able to effect an immediate transformation of the present condition of the world. Heidegger says this is not only true of philosophy, but of all merely human thought and endeavor. Only a God can save us. The sole possibility that is left for us, says Heidegger, quote, is to prepare a sort of readiness through thinking and poetizing for the appearance of the God or for the absence of the God in the time of foundering. For in the face of the God who is absent, we founder. This, one suspects, comes close to Rieff's view, i.e. a kind of postmodern despair, while Nietzsche is still enough of a modern to think that human effort might yet avert catastrophe. Rieff's third culture and Nietzsche's last man have in common the rejection of any transcendent order outside the realm of culture. In Rieff, second culture is characterized by the possibility of remission for violation of the sacred interdicts commands of revelation, but in third culture there are no sacred commands coming from the outside. Thus, the third cultural turn to Freud. The inherited sense of guilt derived from the still extant elements of second world culture is purged via the therapeutic, the third cultural means for the elimination of atavistic guilt. Nietzsche shows us that there is a sense in which late modern liberalism, or post-Hegelian liberalism, proves to be a kind of decayed Christianity. In Hegel, goddess, father, and creator is replaced with reason and history, the idea, the logos, Geist, and the incarnation of God as Christ, whereby sinful humanity is reconciled with God, is replaced with the state by Hegel. One way to make sense of recent and not so recent political history is as a secularization of what Nietzsche calls the religious instinct. However, it no longer finds its object of veneration and obedience in the next world or the next life because it is a third cultural phenomenon. As this worldly, it becomes political. Aristotle understood this well. Prudence and the political become the highest thing if and only if the human being is the highest being in the cosmos. Once God has died, or third culture has vanquished the second, the highest being is surely the human being, though even that is up for debate in third culture, and the natural object of the religious instinct will be the political, as radically separate from the vertical in authority, i.e. as reflecting no sacred order at all. There are then, even in late modernity, religious and moralistic instincts, but these instincts no longer find their satisfaction in a transcendent God or moral principle. If the fundamental question of Rieff's diagnosis is what is to be done, we must confess candidly that Rieff does not offer us much in the way of a roadmap or even hope. Rieff discusses the possibility, it's true, Rieff discusses the possibility of a fourth culture, and he conceives of his own life and work as a death work against third culture, but we are compelled to ask questions about how effective such work can be. Rieff, more pessimistic than Nietzsche, is perhaps also more responsible, and his rhetorical style may be a reflection of that. Rieff is aware that there is always the danger that a social theory can become ideology. Previously, we suggested that Rieff sees no hope for human action to change things. But if this is so, why take the effort of writing Deathworks? Perhaps Rieff's hopelessness, too, is somehow rhetorical, and he writes Deathworks for a far-sighted few in this room. Always flatter the audience, who can perhaps promote the conditions under which a healthier fourth culture can emerge, while doing little to signpost what it could look like or how we might get there. So what does he intend? What is the point of his writing? In 1973's Fellow Teachers, he writes, quote, "I wish no system," that's with a capital S, "and aspire to be anything except the author of a systematics. I am no churchman of one or more." But by 2006's Deathworks, Rieff tells us that he is himself a death worker against third culture in the name of the second. About his own intention, Rieff tells us in his typical, i.e. inscrutable, fashion, that the book is, quote, "intended to support those who will learn how to read that primordial present in order to stop the loosing streak of life, which is so endemic to third culture." He sees himself as engaged in a manner that he did not previously. Between the publication of Fellow Teachers in 1973 and Deathworks in 2006, he has changed his understanding of his own project. No longer merely engaged in theory, Rieff's work now serves as action in a Geisterkrieg against third culture. Nevertheless, as a writer, his chief role seems to be as a critic rather than a Nietzschean commander and legislator. Nietzsche famously described the philosopher as, quote, "the bad conscience of his age, and the one who took the knife vivisectional to the virtues of the age." Rieff comments that, quote, "the function of the critic is to contradict, to play the minority, or better, create one, to be the eternal naysayer, the somewhat disloyal opposition, even of himself and his own criticism." According to Rieff, to be a critic entails that one could, quote, "never quite be a politician, or breed disciples and found a school." This characterization of the critic comes close to half of Nietzsche's characterization of the philosopher, and of his own activity, Nietzsche's activity, as involving a no-saying, which is prefatory to a yes-saying. In Charisma, Rieff writes that, quote, "the charismatic of the present and of Nietzsche's future is the transgressive type who cannot be a mere critic, a writer about honesty, moral courage, generosity, politeness, and intellectual integrity. He must commit his criticism, his thoughts a life act." In other words, the critic of third culture must live the criticism. The death worker against third culture must live against it. And the critic, Rieff above suggested, aims to play or create a minority, in this case, a minority in opposition to the regnant third culture. Nietzsche's Zarathustra famously said, "If something is falling, one should also give it a push," meaning that the ongoing collapse of the old Christian Platonic order should be accelerated for the sake of establishing a new order. Many have overlooked what Zarathustra says almost immediately after, quote, "I am a prelude of better players, my brothers, an exemplary play, act according to my example." Rieff himself, as both death worker and death, provides just such an example. He commits his own criticism in living according to the interdicts of second culture's vertical and authority. In living so, and in writing so, does not Rieff himself give a push to a possible collapsing third culture? Does he not, in good Nietzschean fashion, pave the way for the possibility of a fourth? Does he not, through the act of writing, and not just writing, but writing in a difficult manner that requires great effort to grasp, aim to create the aforementioned minority, i.e. those who can take the critical stance and who can live the critical stance toward third culture? Rieff's writing aims at a description and an etiological analysis of the contemporary cultural crisis, but it also aims, I would suggest, at creating a certain human type who is capable of responding to that crisis. His life is a death work, and his writing is a death work. In working against the regnant third culture, Rieff's death work becomes a life work in that it tries to shape and cultivate souls. Rieff's critic commits his criticism as life act, and that criticism spares nothing and no one, not even his own social theory. Like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, Rieff writes in anticipation of those to come. Perhaps Rieff, like his own unacknowledged teacher, should be numbered among those who are born posthumously. His analysis and rhetoric aim at cultivating in his readers a condition of the soul that allows for liberation from the diktats of third culture because, as he tells us, quote, the study of culture itself is drawn into the war between second and third worlds as a major weapon. This liberation is found in the critical stance, which lives the truth of criticism as life act in relation to the ostensible rejection of authority, that's with a capital A, by third culture. In cultivating such a condition of soul, Rieff prepares readers to function as a future cadre of resistance to third culture in the name of the nascent fourth, which reduplicates the vertical and authority of second culture as a life work, which is itself a death work against third culture. Rieff then offers a surprising and surprisingly Nietzschean optimism because, quote, first world taboos and second world interdicts do not yield for long to third world rules of the culture game. He suggests, again following Nietzsche, that, quote, third world rationalized lives are interims between world enchantments that can never be made rational or enduring. The key difference is that Nietzsche thinks the effort of the commanding and legislating philosopher can avert the disaster he foresees, while Rieff suggests that, in some sense, the meaninglessness of third culture may, in effect, solve the problem on its own. But nonetheless, he writes, despite both his earlier protestations and the evasive esotericism of his later work, Rieff writes for a reason. He is engaged in social theory as soulcraft, for, as he puts it, the function of the sociologist is both scientific and pedagogic. Dealing with moral problems, he must teach moral lessons. Otherwise, his sociology fails to be social enough.
So based on Patterson and my work together, I'm going to focus in particular on Rieff's work on charisma. So the talk is called The Influencer, Artist, and Activist Aren't: The Impossibility of Charisma in the Modern Context. In May of 2023, the unimpeachable midwit standard of authority, the New York Times, self-reported to the strivers reading their Word of the Day column that the old gray lady had used the term charisma 262 times over the previous year. A random sampling of charisma over that term, the first 5 articles, revealed that the term charisma was applied to a fictional gay Quebecois logger, nuclear strength charisma, if you must know. Celebrity dad Robert Downey Sr., New Zealand pharmaceutical enthusiast Jacinda Ardern, and actor Joaquin Phoenix. It was left open to question whether celebrated Florida education reformer Ron DeSantis had sufficient charisma. If we widen our sampling to 10, we get mostly book and movie reviews invoking the term to describe either character or actor, plus Xi Jinping and Martin Luther King. Any term equally applicable to atomic gay loggers, celebrity dads, communist heads of state, and with apologies to the FBI, non-communist civil rights leaders, has become completely meaningless. You might assign blame for this incoherent absurdity to the stupidity of modern people. Philip Rieff blamed Max Weber. In his book, Charisma, the Gift of Grace and How It's Been Taken from Us, Rieff took Weber to task for what is in essence a nihilistic incoherence in the Weberian category of charisma. To Weber, the fundamental basis of charisma is recognition. Weber wrote, quote, "It is recognition on the part of those subject to authority, which is decisive for the validity of charisma." Okay, fine. Recognition of what? Quote, "A certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which he is considered extraordinary and to be treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities." Okay, like who? Quote, "In primitive circumstances, this peculiar kind of quality is thought of as resting on magical powers, whether of prophets, persons with a reputation for therapeutic or legal wisdom, leaders in the hunt, or heroes in war." End quote. Well, Those of us not blinded by Weber's brilliance in other matters might be tempted to ask how on earth all of those figures could be crushed into one category. But if you wondered that, you would not be scientific. Because, quote, how the quality in question would be ultimately judged from any ethical, aesthetic, or other such point of view is naturally indifferent for the purpose of definition. What is alone important is how the individual is actually regarded by those subject to charismatic authority, unquote. So, keeping fact and value safely distinct, Weber then hurls open the gates to nihilism. Quote, since it is extraordinary, charismatic authority is sharply opposed to rational and particularly bureaucratic authority and to traditional authority, whether in its patriarchal, patrimonial, or estate variants. Within the sphere of its claims, charismatic authority repudiates the past and is in this sense specifically a revolutionary force, unquote. So, following Weber, we would have to define charisma first by recognition. Z is charismatic because A, B, and C recognize him as such. Then, by what charisma stands against: order, rationality, the past, and authority. A quick Google search affirms the perverse emptiness of Weberian charisma, now vulgarized. John Lennon, charismatic, returns 215,000 results on Google. Vladimir Lenin, charismatic, returns 260,000. Imagine. Real Madrid soccer legend Cristiano Ronaldo, the world's #1 influencer, returns 798,000 charismatic Google results. If we go from slicing through Barcelona's defenses to slicing through Poland's, Adolf Hitler, charismatic, returns 1,340,000 results. Another figure, famous for filling stadiums full of cheering fans, Taylor Swift, almost catches the Fuhrer, managing 1,010,000 charismatic results. Now, to be fair, religious figures do better numbers when paired with charisma on Google search. Our Lord manages to more than clear Weber's recognition bar for a charismatic with 15 million Google returns. The patron of my church, St. John the Baptist, manages over 1.5 million, but alas, the first return is how St. John the Baptist is like a rock star. So, can Rieff do better conceptually than Weber? Yes. Key to understanding Rieff's conception of charisma is to invert a key aspect of Weber's, far from disrupting his or her culture as a taboo smasher and enemy of authority. The true charismatic, according to Rieff, renews the culture by upholding authority. To understand how the true charismatic fits into a functioning culture, we have to begin with Rieff's conception of culture. So, what is it not? It's not the high culture of the opera house and the idle rich. It's not the best that has been thought and said. It is, as Michael pointed out already, the form of fighting before the firing begins. Rieff's developed theory of culture, and this will warm the hearts of everyone at a Ciceronian Society conference, is historicist and Freudian. So, Rieff the historicist in My Life Among the Deathworks, Rieff divides the history of the West into 3 synchronic worlds or cultures. The first is that of pagan polytheistic antiquity, where an amoral metadivine exists above and before the gods. This menacing metadivine Rieff calls the primacy of possibility. It's dangerous, it must be walled off from mortals, and this walling off is done by taboos. In this culture, men and even the gods are subject to the force of relentless fate. What Rieff calls the second culture is the culture of the Jews and later the Christians. It posits no metadivine above the one God. The one God orders human life through the interdicts, the sacred thou shalt nots. The interdicts are the essence of sacred culture. The one God, having revealed himself, is experienced by faith. Each individual experiences the second culture in the cross-shaped form of a vertical in authority, or via. Atop the vertical is authority, which is approached or understood only through obedience to the interdicts, the sacred thou shalt nots. The opposite of obedience, quote, a lowering act, the violation of interdicts, Rieff calls transgression. Transgression, of course, takes person away from authority downward, though Rieff says, from the vertical in authority, there is no escape. The via also accommodates human frailty with a sort of a cross shape, which he calls the remissions, that which is not done, but which is done with excusing reasons. Rieff calls sacred order this immutable, cross-shaped vertical structure as it is ascertained in the lived social order experience. He wrote that the function of culture is to transmute the sacred order into social orders where every individual lives out his life judging himself on the criterion of ascent or descent in the vertical in authority. To stand without such an order is extremely dangerous. Quote, where there is nothing sacred, there is nothing. Rieff came to believe that the second culture is being inexorably destroyed and replaced by what he called the third culture. This is our contemporary culture, ushered in by an officer class, as he called it, of intellectuals. The chief purpose of this officer class, theorists like Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, Weber, artists like Wilde, Joyce, Duchamp, has been to discredit the interdicts, to dethrone authority, to liberate humankind into a world of limitless possibility. The third culture likes to return to the first culture motifs, but only in a spirit of play, without taking seriously the deadly danger of what Rieff called the constant energy of menace in the first culture meta-divine. While Rieff calls it a third culture for convenience, he doesn't believe modernity produced a culture at all, since a culture is a complex dialogue within and without each person, between the fulfillment and failure to fulfill the interdicts. An internalization of the standard of judgment, right? Modernity doesn't do any of that. Modernity instead produces an anti-culture dedicated to the utter abolition of the interdicts and the dethroning of authority. Its intellectuals are, quote, virtuosi of decreation, which Ethan will talk about. It's forbidden to forbid. Rieff believed a fully formed anti-culture was unprecedented, and he was alarmed. Now, at this point, he could just be another boring culture warrior, right? Down at the casino with Bill Bennett. But there is a deeper layer to this, which makes it so much more alarming. And this is when you consider Rieff the Freudian. In 1979, Rieff wrote that culture is foundational to the character of each individual. This quote is key, quote, safely inside their culture, more precisely, the oppositional authority of a culture unsafely inside them. Members of it are disposed to enact certain possibilities of behavior while refusing even to consider others. The oppositional authority of a culture unsafely inside them. Here's where we see a fissure between Freud and Rieff on what is primary in the ordering of human consciousness. I owe a debt here to Antonius Zondervan, who corresponded with Rieff to draw him out on this point. To Freud, the instinctual drives in the unconscious, inaccessible to conscious reason, constitute the primary process. Rieff rejects Freud's doctrine that these instinctive drives are what is primary in structuring consciousness because the unconscious is formless and chaotic. Quote, Freud's theory of the unconscious has no answer to the question where to find the origin of order in mental processes. Rieff said that a theory is an address to the highest. It can't be founded on formless chaos. For, quote, the origin of order in the mental process, unquote, Rieff instead said there is a primary cultural process. The function of the primary cultural process is, quote, the adaptation of instinctual desires to higher cultural principles. Rieff wrote, to adjust the expression of impulses to the controlling paragon or character ideal defines the primary process in the shaping of our inherited culture. The arts and sciences define the secondary process. To put this another way now, and in my words, Rieff's primary cultural process is rooted in a dialectic, initiated by the culture ideal of the community, thrust into the psyche from without, preconsciously, then reinforced lifelong by the culture external to the psyche. The internal part then strengthened by obedience to the external. Now you understand the emergency of a non-functioning culture. It's a matter of shaping the entire psyche, not simply a matter of how people live in the world or Elvis's hips or whatever. So now we go to charisma. Rieff rejects as a gross oversimplification the idea that the charismatic is simply a creature of recognition, that the group recognizes him, and that's what makes him charismatic, which is at the heart of Weber's definition. However, in the Rieffian conception, you can't isolate the charismatic from the culture of the group either. It's the shared culture in the form of observation of the interdicts which shapes both the charismatic and makes his recognition by the group possible. It's a dialectic. The charismatic in Rieff's theory is not some extraordinarily magnetic disruptor and rule breaker. He is, or rather was, a rare and precious instrument of cultural renewal. In a functioning culture, it is the charismatic who, by extraordinary obedience to the interdicts, returns his fellows to the interdicts by his own interdicted example. Think of the self-denial of the charismatic. Think of the radical poverty of Isaiah, or of John the Baptist, or of St. Martin of Tours, or of St. Francis. These men embody the thou shalt nots. They don't just talk about it. And that embodiment is what gives them social power, which they use self-effacingly, not self-aggrandizingly, in order to restore those around them to the sacred no, and then lead them to the higher life. Let me give you two examples of real charismatics. Wulfric of Hazelbury was a 12th century English anchorite, revered for the severity of his asceticism. His hagiography records a visit to Wulfric by King Stephen. Stephen's regime was so successful, historians refer to it as the anarchy. So the conclusion of the meeting with Stephen, quote, "Finally, after many rebukes and with saving exhortations, Wulfric promised King Stephen this, among other things, that Stephen would certainly reign as long as he lived, and then, because he'd squeezed out of the king certain of his sins, he exhorted the king to do penance, adding that until Stephen should repent, it was impossible that his throne could be strengthened, and there would be no peace. Having heard these things, King Stephen began weeping copiously, and making confession of his sins, he presented his cheek to the prophet to be struck and spat upon." This is the sovereign of the country. Let us consider a better known incident from Robert of Knaresborough, a 12th century hermit in Yorkshire. Brian de Isle wanted to show King John, who was visiting him, his hermit, who he'd been sponsoring on his grounds. And so he takes John out riding to visit his hermit. They had a better class of rich people then. And so here is the visit. Having entered the little chapel, they discovered the man of God prostrate before the altar in prayer. He didn't want to leave off the prayers he'd already begun. Nevertheless, in spirit, Robert discerned the ostentatious approach of the king himself. Brian, seeing that the hermit was not rising for the king, nor showing the reverence due him, said, "Brother Robert, get up, hurry. Behold, here is John, the Lord our king." So Robert got up and said to Brian, "Show me which is king." Brian replied, "Here is my king, John, illustrious among kings." Now the man of God picked up a certain ear of grain, held it out to the king in his hand, and asked, "Are you able, my lord, king, to create out of nothing by your own sort of power?" So Wulfric can strike and spit on King Stephen. Robert can humiliate King John, because John, Stephen, Wulfric, Robert, Brian de Isle, and everyone watching inhabit the same functioning symbolic. Wulfric is able to bodily confront King Stephen because his self-denying ascetical vocation incarnates the sacred no. Stephen must admit he has transgressed it and accept his punishment. Likewise, Robert is able by his austerities to confront a powerful tyrant. With power, hermit and king alike acknowledge is forever beyond the royal power. According to Rieff, the charismatic and a functioning symbolic is a holy terror. Robert of Knaresborough showed King John terror in a handful of grain. In contrast to this, what our culture calls charisma simply isn't. Weber was wrong. Charisma was never widely hailed virtuosity and rule smashing. No one steeped in the second culture would have accepted any of our contemporary celebrities, power brokers, or leaders as moral guides. Only Dr. King would have even come close. And for a reason James and I get into in our chapter, even he falls short. It's not though modern people don't feel the lack, setting aside the million grosser examples of the famous mindlessly being labeled as charismatic, we do periodically experience pathetic attempts by moderns to manufacture figures of such compelling moral authority. hippies lionized for refusing to come down from trees, while developers curse and the cameras roll. Furious little Scandinavian school skippers sputtering "how dare you" at events organized by billionaire green capitalists. TV preachers riding in their private jets to offer word faith miracles. None of these can ever command the assent of the whole culture because we don't have a whole culture. Real charismatics can't be manufactured. They don't get put together, they get grown. They are interdictory virtuosi in the vertical of authority, and the third culture has poisoned that soil. It can produce only therapeutic men. The therapeutic, following Freud, relaxes, if not erases, the interdictory standards. It collapses the vertical in authority. After all, religion is an illusion that has no future. Authority isn't real. Its outmoded moral demands, by interfering with the desires, create a sort of a sad sickness. In the third culture, where authority is ridiculed and it's forbidden to forbid, the true charismatic guide to spiritual health simply looks sick.
So Bill has written an entirely new paper for this conference. These are the same remarks that I gave at the ISI conference a few months ago. And for context, at that conference, there had just been a panel on the state of public education in the United States. Thank you. I'm always hunched over no matter what I do. So at that conference, there had just been a panel on the state of public education in the United States. And one of the speakers told us that the rot begins in kindergarten. And the other had said that the main idea coming out of the schools of education is that pupils should be empowered to create their own meaning from their experiences. And it just so happens that this is precisely what Philip Rieff called the second death of the teaching profession, the death of the teaching soul, as he put it in fellow teachers. The idea that teaching should provide conditions in which young people can create themselves, create their own meaning, their own reality on the basis of their arbitrary individual preferences. When the teaching profession reaches such a point, it's clear that it's given up the ghost. The body is still alive, but it's a zombie, the soul is gone. So what then is the purpose of education? Rieff answers, quote, to conserve and transmit a vision of the highest with a veto complicit in every vision. That is what is higher about education. So the vision of the highest makes demands on us. In order to live up to that vision, we have to veto some of our own inclinations. Sacred order demands renunciations, as you've already heard. In the therapeutic world that we inhabit, after Freud, the veto complicit in every vision has taken a pseudonym, repression. So every no is now repression. To avoid this repression, the modern dispensation demands respect for lifestyles. Everyone may choose his own lifestyle. The purpose of education is to help the young person find himself, to find a lifestyle that suits his preferences. Rieff comments on this as follows in Fellow Teachers. Lifestyles proclaim that there are no true ways of ascent or descent, but only a permanent war of changing personal and class preferences. In our uncertain manners, coarse voices, frayed tempers, and undress, we appear engaged in a massive identification downwards, toward that which is not to be done. I said undress. Let it all hang out was a call to indecency. Until we are created again in the garden, concealment, reticence, modesty, even secrecy about our private lives and parts are essential to all goods, truths, and beauties. Now, this passage was especially striking to me because I first read it on the train on Amtrak. And if you've been on Amtrak, Gregory, it's not just let it all hang out. You know, some people don't even bathe, it seems. And so in the 19th century, I think people carried around what were called sachet de senteur, which you could put up to your nose to mask the smell. But that's where we are now. So this is what self-creation leads to. It means dehumanization, descent to the bestial, to the barbaric. The new dispensation creates a new kind of barbarian. And here's another quote from fellow teachers. Barbarians have never before existed. Barbarians are people without historical memory. Barbarism means more than radical contemporaneity. It means play at being man or human. Barbarism means the universality of those re-educated or brutalized out of membership in the binding particularities of their culture and being able to entertain all, inhibited by no new God terms. But of course, self-creation uninhibited by a higher vision is not only the goal of modern education, as far as I could tell. In the United States, it has been elevated to a constitutional right. Consider the well-known statement of Justice Kennedy in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under compulsion of the state. So Rieff declares, again in Fellow Teachers, as teachers we must be at war with the cultic lifestyle. Now, in his book, Fellow Teachers, Rieff's advice is directed toward his fellow university professors, so this advice doesn't necessarily apply to all levels of education. But he says that the main duty of teachers is to give interpretations of great books, so not to teach job skills, not to become activists or gurus, dispensing, as he says, final solutions to the social and political problems of the day, but to teach good books because the right books will shape the readers in the right way. And of course, this all sounds perfectly reasonable and moderate. But in his later writings, Rieff, as you've already seen, becomes darker. So one begins to doubt that such moderate prescriptions will be adequate. So now I'm going to the portion of my paper that's just copied out of the article that I wrote. So there's one bomb that Rieff kept throwing that continued to make many of his students uncomfortable. He suggested that Freud, in publishing his last book, Moses and Monotheism, he said Freud was the murderer of Moses, and that Freud was on a level with Hitler as a destroyer of the Jewish people. So that's the claim that I want to analyze a little bit here. So Rieff discerns two distinct assaults on the Jewish people in Freud's death work. In the first place, Freud attacks the Jewish people's identity. He robs them, there's a lot of quotations in here, he robs them of the greatest of their sons, their founding figure of authority, made over into an Egyptian. Freud himself acknowledges in the first sentence of his book that he has undertaken to deny a people the man whom it praises as the greatest of his sons, but asserts that one must seek the truth irrespective of the cost of supposed national interests. So Freud, this high officer in the Third World Army, felt duty-bound to express his scientific truth, wildly speculative though it was, debunking the religion of the Jews and their founding hero at a time when they were subject also to physical destruction. The man who was the human mediator between the Jewish people and God, the one who delivered to them God's commandments, bound them to the covenant, and thereby made them a people, is taken from them in the hour of their greatest need. Second, this assault on the Jews had a significance far beyond the fate of the Jewish people themselves. Rieff describes Hitler as a great third world artist precisely in his promotion into practice of the clean sweep, the brush aimed first and foremost at the kingdom of priests and holy nation, however members in that kingdom may rebel against their membership. So Hitler and other third world anti-Semites, he says, saw the Jews as the archetypal priestly and holy nation, the second world nation that became the model for all the others by being the first to bind its members to an ethic of renunciation, subduing the primordial freedom of pagan or savage cultures. In this sense, both Hitler and Freud sought the same thing, the defeat of the ethic of renunciation, of which the Jewish religion was the primary symbol in world history, so that the primordial freedom could return. Rieff thus concludes, Hitler's real death work is strangely like Freud's fictive death work, an originally Jewish mortal crime against the immortal primordial world. Now, one could argue, although let me emphasize that Rieff himself does not, but maybe I suppose I do, that in the long run, the Freudian type of death work, and of course there's another question as to how many people actually read this book and were influenced by this particular work, but this kind of thing, you could say, is ultimately worse than the Hitlerian approach. So consider the following statement from a very obscure person that I write about, Konstantin Leontiev, who says this: peaceful inventions, telephones, railroads, etc., are 1,000 times more harmful than the inventions of military technology. The latter kill many individual persons, but the former kill step by step all living organic life on Earth. Poetry, religion, the individuation of states and ways of life. So Leontiev, for context, was crediting the observation of John Stuart Mill On Liberty, that the phenomenon of globalization homogenizes classes and nations, reduces the great social diversity of medieval Europe to a few common human types. And it took this to be the ultimate dehumanizing force of modernity. Modern weapons technology could physically destroy a portion of a nation, but as long as the remnant retained its religion, customs, arts, literature, and historical memory, its people could continue to live its own distinctive way of life. Modern communications technology is worse because it can, albeit slowly, accomplish what military technology cannot. That is, break down the religion, customs, and memory of the people by swamping them with the cheap delights of mass consumption and the easy enjoyment of a generic global culture. For Rieff, the Freudian deathworks have a similar long-term effect. By attacking religion and culture, they dissolve peoples. The effect of the deathwork, if it is believed, is to close off man's access to the sacred order, and also, as an additional consequence, often to deny him a livable social order as well. In Freud's therapeutic truth, is another quotation, all worlds as creations of culture receive their energies from transgression and its repetition. The world is founded on a primal crime and the denial of that crime in its repetitions. So in Moses and monotheism, Freud makes religion into something derivative of primitive eroticism and a primal parasite. The murder of Moses and the supposed judicial murder of Christ, Freud tells us, awakened in the people a memory trace from the prehistoric human hordes who, driven by Oedipal resentment, murdered and ate their fathers. That's the origin of religion, according to Freud. And so, of course, the obvious problem with this, Rieff quotes several times throughout his works Freud's letter to Fleiss, which says, "How many things turn into filth before my eyes." Rieff goes on, with this scabrous sentence, Freud reinvented primitivist erotic religiosity in its new vicissitude as a world turning up its nose at its own stench. Primordiality has become a POP baseness from which Freudian theory offers no escape other than into an equally promiscuous sublimation. So in Freud's view of reality, there is no escape from baseness. We are always smelling the filth. You can't get away from it. There's no way to ascend. Repugnant primordialities are at the foundation of everything. The emancipators have brought about the degradation, the dehumanization of humankind. He who symbolically murders the likes of Moses and Jesus, thus in the long run accomplishes the murder of peoples and the destruction of souls. And so this is by no means an unserious claim, even though it has made some of, I think that to be the fundamental claim that Rieff is making, which has made some of his students uncomfortable. All right, now what I want to turn to at the end here is, yes, Rieff is very, very pessimistic, and does he have a solution? It's not entirely clear. I just want to mention in closing here that there is one modern state about which Rieff seemed to be optimistic, and one of the last articles he published is Not the Truth. He looks to Israel and says, the Israelis might be doing the right thing here. And this is a quotation. He says, as I understand the Israeli school curriculum, sacred history in those classical texts is taught as the history of Israel. If not, then the Machstadt of Israel will have no foundation in the Kulturstadt. Given the radical psychologizing of diaspora Jewry in America, the future of the Jews depends upon the maintenance of its holy nationality. So is in other quotations that I won't read today, he's quite critical of the American founding. He says suggests that it's essentially flawed from its inception because there's no recognition of sacred order in that approach. But and also we end up with the separation of church and state. But in Israel, he seems to suggest they're willing to teach sacred history as the history of the nation, and so the state plays a role in defending the right kind of culture. But what application that might have to other countries, Rieff has really nothing to say that I could find. Thank you.
So my name is Albert Norton. I am going to speak, I am going to mention Philip Rieff, but my subject is going to be a little broader than that. I'm going to talk about the therapeutic, specifically the therapeutic worldview, and why it's a worldview, but for which Rieff is the chief expositor. And so let me start with this. I do have a book coming out next month. It's called The Discovered Self on this subject. The subtitle of it is Identity in the Therapeutic Age. So that's what I've adopted for the title of my paper and for the remarks that I'll have for you today. Before I move forward with that, let me take a half step back and talk about postmodernism for just a moment. So postmodernism requires some definition, and I undertook to do that, but it took an awful lot of study because everybody talks about postmodernism and nobody knows what it is. So after studying it quite a bit, I wrote a couple of books, one in 2021 and one in 2023. Was when they were published. The first one is called Dangerous God. The second one is The Mountain and the River. So I'm now going to tell you what postmodernism is because I had to work really hard to figure it out. What I believe it is a collapse of what Philip Rieff called the verticals in authority. It's essentially a move into the third world that you've just heard described a couple of times. So what's replacing it is, in my view, among the postmodernists, is some form of Hegelian dialectic. And I came to think of all of the postmodern philosophers as being engaged in process philosophy. It's what you get to when you throw off moral realism. So there's no longer any moral structure embedded in the cosmos. Now we got to make it up as we go along. In that sense, you might say that we're worse off than the pagans ever were. Now, in that study of postmodernism, I felt like it was a little bit incomplete. It's essentially talking about propositions. They're ideas. You can argue about them. You can be persuaded or unpersuaded to the tenets of these postmodern thinkers. But I realized as I was finishing up that second book that, there's still a piece of this that remains. And that's why I'm taking this half step backwards, is because I'm going to assert that the therapeutic worldview is a subset of postmodernism. And when I get to the end of it, hopefully I'll tie it up in a way that makes sense. So the therapeutic is a subjective element of postmodernism. What it basically means is, because there's no longer moral structure to the world, you have to look within rather than looking up. But here's the thing about the therapeutic worldview, in my opinion. Is that it's particularly insidious, and this is where I'm using the word worldview in a particular way, that the system of thought itself precludes any kind of criticism of the system itself. So in that sense, it's like a speculative system, in the words of Eric Vogelin. It's something that just sort of floats in the air by itself, and it's unattached to the natural order of the world and the natural order by which the mind works to perceive the world. Here's the key element of therapeutic. This is the single element of the therapeutic, and that is emotivism. And I stumbled over that word at first, and I had to reread and study from different authors. Of course, I started with Alistair McIntyre, who talked about that, but others as well. And so I came to understand that, okay, it's the word emotivism, but they're not talking about just receiving everything in an emotional way. What it really means is that you accept your feelings about something as being authoritative about whatever it is that you're evaluating. It actually harkens back to the positives. So positivists, in particular A.J. Ayer, who famously said that the statement, quote, "murder is wrong," unquote, doesn't say anything about murder. It only says something about the person that utters the statement. So obviously, the whole idea that that murder can be wrong is off the table, and now everything is something that we make up in our inner being. All right, so now I'm going to turn to identity. And I'm going to suggest first a certain kind of identity. When I say identity, I mean it in a normal sense of the word, the sense of yourself that you have, how you think about yourself. So I'm going to call this the negotiated self. The significance of the negotiated self is that it rests on an idea of moral agency. You have moral agency as you participate, because that's what you're doing, participating in the world. And your dignity as a human being corresponds to that moral agency. Moral agency corresponds to dignity, dignity to moral agency. As I say, it's participatory in the world, which in a sense means that you push against the world in the exercise of your agency, and it pushes against you. So when I was a teenager, I said to the world that I'm going to be a famous football player, and the world pushed back against me and said, no, you're not. So what happens is you take all the sum of all of your disappointments, your successes, your affirmations, everything good and bad that happens to you in the course of your life, and that's you negotiating with the world and coming up with a sense of who you are. And by the way, one thought on this is, if you're familiar with the work of Michael Polanyi, he talks about tacit knowledge. And he uses lots of examples, but one of them is that tacit knowledge is how you handle a hammer. You're not focused on the hammer, you're focused on the nail you're trying to hit. So your sense of who you are is a form, in fact, he talks about this, is a form of tacit knowledge. So as you're engaged with the world out there, you're focusing on how you're going to participate in the world. You're not thinking about who you are. You're not bogged down in self-consciousness. You have only what he calls subsidiary knowledge of the person that you are. In other words, it's not something you carry around with you like a burden. All right, so that's negotiated self. I'm going to turn to a divided self. There are, if you're going to think of a divided self, there's a couple of fairly innocuous ways that you can see that the self is divided. All of us are in some way or another. For example, you make a New Year's resolution. Well, who are you making it for? There's the person doing the resolving, and then the person that's got to keep the resolution. So there's two of you right there, you might say. And here's another innocuous example, and that is in the field of consciousness, philosophy of consciousness, the idea of intersubjectivity, meaning that you're one person when you're all by yourself, but you're in another person when you're in society, even if it's only a society of two. You think of yourself in a different way. So if you were able to compare the way you think about yourself in those two different environments, you would see that there's a sense in which you're a divided self. But now, the divided self can also be quite a dangerous thing. What I'm going to suggest to you, this is pretty crucial, is that the divided self in this dangerous way comes about through a sense of transgression. You might call it a dissatisfaction with the way the world is. You might recognize that usually the dissatisfaction with the way the world is because of evil in the world, and you might recognize that the laying of the ground for Gnosticism. And in fact, I believe that what we have is a resurgence of Gnosticism in this way of identity formation. If you've read your Eric Vogelin on Gnosticism, he talks about this and does ascribe it to the same thing, which is this dissatisfaction with the way the world is. That's why he goes into Gnosticism. But he kind of stops there. So he's talking about all the different ideologies that you can slip into. He mentions psychotherapy, which we would probably call the therapeutic. He mentions positivism and other ideologies like National Socialism and communism and Marxism, which he dealt with specifically. But I want to refer you instead of to somebody like Vogelin, a psychotherapist who is also a Marxist, who is also an atheist, who is also an existentialist, named R.D. Laing, who wrote a book in 1959 called The Divided Self. Because I actually, after I thought about it, I thought, wow, this really expresses what I'm trying to get to with the divided self better than somebody on my team, so to speak. First of all, he said there is a dissonance that occurs within the person. This is the beginning of dissatisfaction with the way the world is. Where does that dissonance come from? Well, it comes from the oppression in the world, because everything is an oppressive system. And it creates a sort of schizoid self, schizoid being his word. And that results in a person that is kind of under threat all the time, feels that he's a victim, is hypersensitive to what other people think. You may begin to recognize this person in my remarks here. And he had a phrase for it. He called it ontological insecurity, because he was an existentialist. So I thought about that. I mentioned him in what I've written, but I thought about it some more. And I thought, you know what? Lang was right about everything except the most important thing. Because that's right, there is a dissonance, and that does result in a divided self. The problem is it doesn't come from oppressive social systems. It comes from unhitching yourself from sacred authority. It comes from the fact that your conscience still indicts you because it's right there all the time. It comes from the fact that you know justice is real, and therefore you know that we're accountable for how we exercise our moral agency. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the worst instance that I can think of of discovered self, or maybe the more alarming. I'm going to suggest that divided self, that schizoid self, can manifest in a host form and an identity form. So the host is passive. There's no moral agency being exercised there. In identity, this is to take another step beyond what, for example, Vogelin did in talking about Gnosticism. That identity manifests within. It is something you discover inside of yourself. It's not a spiritual spark. Rather, it is or I should say, sorry, not a spiritual spark, but a spiritual esotericism. It's not spiritual esotericism like in the Gnostics of old. Rather, it's a materialist esotericism. And where it comes from is from the changing social mores. We're back to this is why I started with postmodernism, back to social process, the dialectic. It occurs within as well as out there. So this is important. The result is that the discovered self is devoted to the social zeitgeist more than anything else. That's his reason for being. And therefore, that opens him up to ideological capture. And I mean ideological capture pejoratively. I mean it in the sense of one of these self-sustaining systems that floats around in the air by itself. For the discovered self, instead of being reconciled to the fact of evil in the world, as you would be under Christianity, for example. I mean, we recognize that there's good and evil in the world. In fact, it cuts right through every heart. But instead of being reconciled to that fact through religion, the idea is to reject the very idea of a moral structure at all, and to be good in every way, and no evil running through the heart. Where does good and evil come from? Not from eternality, from temporality, from what society is telling us in a given moment. As long as you find the flow and get in it and stay with it, you're good to go. That's the discovered self. All right. So I'm going to finish with this. In the therapeutic worldview, imagine you hold this therapeutic worldview. We're all formed together in the river of time. And when you see somebody who steps outside of that river of time, who would that be? Well, that would be one of these superstitious, hypocritical, bigoted people who still subscribe to moral realism, to a moral structure in the world. They are a serious threat. In Lang's terms, they would create ontological insecurity for you. And because they are a serious threat, your feelings toward them are not mutual tolerance, but rather they must go. Those hidebound folks must go. And that maybe explains some of the attitude that you encounter if you are a member of something like this organization. All right. It explains the hysterical demand for conformity to the shifting social ethics in everything. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
So we have time for questions if you have any. Yes, sir.
This was, I think, probably for you, Bill.
Okay.
And
Stay here.
Preface it by saying, as a devoted Weberian, so I want to pose this to you to see what your response is. So, talking about Weber's charisma, right? You can't talk about charisma in a Weberian sense without also talking about the routinization of charisma.
Right.
So the whole reason Weber came up with the idea of charisma was to try to explain how single individuals operating in a social system can transform their idiosyncrasy into something that survives through time and beyond themselves and influences society, right? But he's doing that in a very, very descriptivist framework, right? So, and he's not necessarily critiquing the phenomenon or setting it up. And in that sense, I think, so Taylor Swift is not charismatic in a Weberian sense.
OMG.
She doesn't have real authority and is not willing to establish now. Martin Luther King Jr. might be, right? Because if he established organizations that survive, I don't know about details of his life for that. Certainly St. Francis would be, right? And then the explanation there would be why the St. Francis's particular charisma survived through time. It's scrutinization. And maybe some of the mystics that you bring up might also fit, right? So I don't know if Big would actually disagree with the characterization used, the examples of charisma. So is this simply a distinction between a descriptivist tradition in Weber and a normativist angle in Rieff? Are they basically trying to do different jobs, or do you see that they're kind of doing the same thing and therefore are in exact conflict?
So I think briefly there's two different things to answer. First of all, I think Weber's idea about the routinization of charisma is actually much more historically valid and useful than his attempt to grasp with the charisma itself. I think you can separate routinization, which I think he describes pretty well, and which I think later institutional historians of religion have done good things with his failure to have a very good grasp on what was the charisma in the first place. I think you can separate those and have one still be useful. So that'll be the first part. The second part would be Rieff. One of the wonderful things about Rieff, if you start to study him, is every time he goes after one of the theorists he disagrees with, he credits them with thinking of his critique before he does. It's really, he's one of the most generous thinkers we've ever read. He does this in his break with Weber, in his break with Freud. Who else? One other one, I can't remember. He does this all the time. So what Rieff says about Weber's failure, in other words, he's described the diagnostic failure, then he explains the failure. And he says it's Weber's insistence on the fact-value distinction. He says he is so married to his hard-boiled secularism that he simply is not going to allow himself to see anything which would be spiritually special in these people. So he has to go with the scientifically replicable aspects of their behavior and reception, because you can't ground it in religion, because that would be unscientific. So that would be, is that a fair, yeah, that's kind of what you're driving at, right?
Yeah, I think so. I just, normative descriptive as distinction is not even relevant, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Collapse.
Yeah.
But just a clarifying question about the second world and the
Sure.
fourth world, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay. Is Rieff trying to defend the second world or bring about the fourth world, or does he neither of these things?
So Rieff wants to say that the vast majority of us, certainly those of us in this room, are kind of pulled. We have 1 foot in the second world and 1 foot in the third world. The third world,
It is.
yeah. The third world will inevitably, he wants to say, collapse. Right? He says the kind of abeyance of first and second world in the face of third world anti-culture can only be temporary. Now, what's going to come out of that and what form the collapse will take? There is a wonderful passage that you seem to always have ready at hand.
I don't this time, but yes, I usually
where he talks about the skyscrapers made of glass that's going to be very delightful to see it explode and fall apart. And the point Rieff is making is that third culture is most likely going to end, because it will end in, I think it's fair to say, an orgy of violence. because there is no restraining, and I'm tempted to say no civilizing principle for Rieff. Now, fourth culture, he gives you a fairly vague description of what it's going to be. He has this passage in Crisis of the Officer Class where he kind of hopefully suggests that you're going to see this this convergence of Christians and Jews on the level of orthopraxis. But beyond that, he's not that clear about what it's going to look like. And I'm tempted to say, although I can't think of any specific claims that would back this up, that fourth culture, as he describes it, is one possibility. But we might also see a return, and maybe we even do see this in certain ways, to certain elements of first culture. I saw something the other day about Greeks trying to recreate the Olympian religion. And on the one hand, this is ridiculous. This is cosplay. But on the other hand, I think things like that show that there is this kind of longing in the midst of third culture for those who are perhaps more purely third cultural than many of us. There is this longing for something. So perhaps one element of what fourth culture looks like is you might have some sort of sincere return to these sorts of things. I'm a little skeptical about that for a number of different reasons. But third culture, the collapse, I think, seems to be inevitable, to the point where I'm tempted to say a lot of what we see going on now in Western society, Western civilization as a whole, is let's say, the early stages of the collapse that Rieff is talking about.
I had a similar question because I found that interesting. And I wrote down, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I thought you had said that the fourth culture he predicted to be a merger of first and second, but he means more reconciliation of Jewish Christian.
What he's arguing is that at one point he says, listen, the cataclysm that will end the third culture is going to be so horrible that people won't need to be told that you can't do that again. And so they will begin to impose these restraints gratefully on themselves because they've experienced the full throttle alternative. And so he says Judaism and Christianity merging is a way of strengthening the interdicts and the prohibitions because they just will not want to go back. But he talks about, Aristotle said the sense of touch is the most dangerous, and Rieff talks about how there will be a very severe curtailment of the sense of touch. The whole essay is about what won't be allowed once people experience the collapse that's coming. But he says you can only see it in shade because until the cataclysm occurs, you won't really have a handle on how far people are willing to go in severe self-disciplines to make sure that the third culture never happens again.
Interesting. And then one last question there. I see his first, second culture distinction. However, it seems a bit excessively, was he conscious of the tradition that would see a synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem, that in the medieval culture, a synthesis of morality and myth and narrative?
He calls them synchronic.
Right.
And he says they overlap each other, but with one stronger in the character of men and stronger at any given time. So he says the first culture, even now, continues in sort of a mocking parody of the first. But he's ambivalent about what to do with the philosophers. At one point, he actually makes Plato a honorary second culture man.
Yeah, and he kind of, there's a little, I want to say it might even be a footnote in Deathworks, where he says that this assimilation of pagan antiquity and classical philosophy under the heading of first culture. There is a point where he says, this might not really work, but it's a useful shorthand for thinking about this stuff.
Or anyone on the panel, but it's provoked by Michael's presentation. We're talking about how third culture for Rieff has no sacred and therefore is a culture of last men. Did Rieff ever address anything about kind of the transhumanist turn or tech, or is there something applicable to this?
So I am tempted to say that while he does not, to my recollection, ever explicitly address this, I am tempted to say that he would look at the transhumanist turn, let's call it the postmodern project of conquering nature, as being part of the third culture, because partly what we're doing is it is an attempt to remove that last standard independent of the human will, right? If we get down to genetic editing and things like this, we can no longer even appeal to human nature as a standard by which we're going to judge what's right and what's wrong.
And he hates all the ancestors of transhumanism. He has nothing nice to say about abortion. He despises eugenics. So if you kind of go through the things that are the run-up to transhumanism, because of course he died in 2006, there's no way that he would have looked with favor upon the stuff farther down that branch because of what he has to say about the things which led up to that moment, which I can't think of a thing that he had any sympathy for.
Yeah.
It's like a death cell.
It is, and I think he would have said that.
Yeah.
So it's easy to comprehend in stages in a kind of stadial view of history or a Hegelian progression of history. But that second culture was rich with its own eschatology. And where do those things connect in his thought, if at all?
Do you want me to do this one? The longest chapter in the book,
Yeah.
and the densest, is Rieff's metaphysic and if he has one, which was mine. And the answer is, it is impossible to get at what is, I called it the peculiar God of Philip Rieff. We call it that because it's a God peculiar to him. Rieffian capital A authority. 52 pages, and when I'm done, all that can be explained is his reticence, which I believe I have satisfactorily explained. What cannot be captured is whether he is a theist or he's not. And that was deliberate. He was not going to be clearly a theist or clearly not. And so while you can make just as good an argument that he's a religious functionalist as you can that he was some kind of religious believer, but certainly no eschatology in Judaism and Christianity was going to cause him to submit his eschatology to that authoritative one. That wasn't going to happen. I think that's time, right?
Just about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
You have been listening to The Sower, a podcast of the Ciceronian Society. To learn more about us, our annual conference, our peer-reviewed journal, and our video podcast, On Duties, please visit ciceroniansociety.org. Thank you for listening.